It seems to me there are two broadly different approaches to stand-up, and by association to all art, each with their own strengths. At commercial British comedy chains like Jongleurs or The Comedy Store, performers tell you about your life and things that always happen to you, and you may feel comforted by this. Go beyond the usual venues and you may see acts advance ideas that would not normally have occurred to you. In his book, Improvisation, Derek Bailey assumes a position in opposition to the very act of musical composition itself, but there's a kind of social need both for songs we can all sing and for jokes about buses always being late and men being different to women and dogs being different to cats. Only the most extreme Wire subscriber would deny the potential of all-embracing utilitarian art. It's just that all-embracing utilitarian art tends to be a bit shit. When millions wept for their own mortality after the death of Princess Diana, all they were offered was an Elton John song with the words changed a bit. Oh, hello. I didn't see you there. My name is Ian, and today we're talking about Christie Davies' jokes that follow mass-mediated disasters in a global electronic age. If you've read this, you've probably been exposed to jokes that you might not have been anticipating. I imagine that you're actually kind of convinced by his argument, because his argument is so very sound. And I think you're also perhaps a little bit flummoxed by how he has no compunction to not editorialize when he wishes to editorialize. Davies was a delightful character, eccentric, clearly opinionated, and by the virtue of what was the bulk of his subject matter, jokes, racist jokes, ethnic jokes, offensive jokes, dark jokes, he certainly wasn't afraid to talk about things, and he was a kind person. Does not necessarily mean that he subjected himself to the strictures of politesse. So if you have more chance to read his work, you should. Now, a joke is an interesting thing because jokes are genres. I mean, we at the very least we have a named thing in popular parlance called the joke. It can take, of course, many forms. There's the one-liner, there's the riddle joke, there's the sort of the short anecdotal joke, but you know what distinguishes a joke from other forms of short tale or short story is the end with the punchline, in that fundamentally it all relies on the twist. Whether you want to call it a twist or perhaps what better instead what Oring calls the appropriate incongruity. Oring uses incongruity theory and his own idea of appropriate incongruity in order to explain the joke. There are many theories of the joke. There are many theories of humor, all of which are fine. I find joke theory, humor theory, important, and yet not something one necessarily needs to have a very firm and strict opinion on or a school of thought in order to talk about jokes in general. Certainly in terms of jokes as they exist in performance. I'm not 100% convinced that. And one of the problems I find with humor theory is that they use joke as their baseline, as like their sort of core unit. But I think the joke is a very distinct and rare form. I don't know many places where people are actively telling jokes. I think we probably all have a couple in our passive repertoires that we can conjure up. So we have jokes in our repertoire, and clearly jokes are written and performed or shared to a certain extent. They're rarely performed on stage, The closest that we might have is sort of the monologue joke, but even then, that's more like of the anecdote variety. It isn't a riddle and it isn't a one-liner. Jokes are the exception to instances of humor rather than the rule, but humor theory is really predicated on jokes as their example. So it's a little bit wonky that way. But we are talking about jokes. Davies is talking about jokes. And so even though the form of the joke has existed for a while, and jokes have often been about the topical, I think jokes tend to be, they can be ephemeral. In fact, they probably are, for the most part, ephemeral. And that's why we don't really have a huge preponderance of examples prior to someone finally deciding to write them down. So Oring has another book which he describes as the first Jewish joke book. There were some collections of at least witticisms in Rome and Greece, but they were the rarity, and they weren't necessarily the joke as we might properly understand them today. We wouldn't recognize them as jokes in the same way that we would a contemporary joke book. So there's forms, there's expectations that are present within the joke. But therefore, there are forms and there are expectations. It is a creative act. It has an aesthetics, and it has a context. When one is in particular kinds of modes of interaction, that is when the joke is appropriate. And when one is in different modes, that's when the joke is considered inappropriate. If you come across a joke in a house of worship, chances are it is actually the momentary entry into one kind of genre in order to fundamentally bolster the message of, say, a homily. So jokes are employed as icebreakers. Jokes are employed as a number of ways of greasing the social wheels and allowing for interactions to take place and allowing for a certain form of conviviality. Jokes are ultimately fun, despite the fact that jokes tend to circle around not necessarily the taboo, although clearly one of the things that he's talking about here are subjects that one could describe as taboo. But they're hovering around they distinguish themselves as distinct from the straightforward and the earnest and the sincere. I mean, one of the things that a pun does is it reminds you that the world is comprised of words that through the accident of history often sound like other words that have very different meanings. And so the wordplay of puns, if you like the wordplay of puns, is simultaneously a meta-commentary on the very nature of language itself and how it is represented through sound in a weird way. You can read puns, but puns are meant to be spoken more than anything else. A pun is meant to be spoken. And then we have this interesting phenomenon. So his argument I really like, and as I'm reading it again today, it's given me a couple of things to chew over. But it's an argument that he, in some ways, he bases on an earlier work of Oring, as he cites Oring's article on jokes following the Challenger disaster. And Oring's basic observation was that so many of the jokes involved commercial products, 7-Up, Ocean Spray, and so on, Head and Shoulders, that couldn't simply be an accident. And that the disaster jokes following the disaster jokes that he was seeing were fundamentally inextricable from the fact that we were receiving this news and watching these images and watching the footage again and again unfold on television, where it is juxtaposed with other communicative acts, expressly commercials. And however one wants to describe television as a distancing medium, as well as it being sort of like a hot medium in terms of bringing it into your room, it is nevertheless a what would be appropriate term, polyphonous medium. It's dialogic in the Bakhtinian sense, in that there's so many different discourses going on at the same time. And that is one of the diatribes that Davies goes on, which is, again, a kind of a wonderful thing. So, I mean, he knows the history of jokes, and he knows the history of quote-unquote dark humor or sick humor as good, if not better, than almost anyone else on the planet. And, suggesting that these disaster jokes didn't happen. And he wants to distinguish between jokes about disasters and the potential dark jokes that might have been told by people as they were going through the horrific. We don't have remnants of those. We don't even have necessarily reports about those. And he talks about sort of the soldiers in the First World War, and that subsequently there were a couple of instances of comedy that came from it, but we don't have the jokes if they existed. But he does recognize that there are jokes that are told by people in severe in places of severe distress, places like Timothy Tangerlini's work on the joke lore and the legend telling of paramedics, and the jokes that veterinarians tell, or firefighters or police. They can be and soldiers, and they can be sort of dark humor that is about the threat that is imminent. And so you can start to make the sort of the psychological arguments about the emancipatory role that humor might be playing, or the way that by addressing it, it is something that is therefore like some kind of coping mechanism. And he dismisses that with disaster jokes. He said, well, these aren't people who are feeling the weight of this. This is the issue of these disasters that are being reported to them. And we don't have them prior to the age of television. We did have the beginning of sort of dark jokes, and to the point of being collected, being more accessible, starting in like the mid-1950s. These jokes of the late 1950s and early 1960s occurred during a period of confident modernity and of faith in progress and science and in economic growth through the beneficent oligopolistic competition of big business, which were producing endless product improvements and wealth. So you had these sick jokes that were already emerging and already recognizable. But it really wasn't until Kennedy and the Kennedy assassination that you had these jokes. You first had a lot of jokes about Kennedy himself and his Roman Catholicism because of the Protestant hegemony of the United States, and Kennedy being the first Catholic. There was an awful lot of anti-Catholic jokes that were specifically directed towards Kennedy. And then after his assassination, there were jokes about that, and they were conspicuous because they seemed to go against. There's not so much going against decorum per se, although that's an argument, but rather they're going against the expectation of a sort of cultic American civic religion, and that the deference owed certainly attacks against the state and attacks against individuals, and sort of a piety that ought to be displayed. And the jokes didn't reflect that. And his argument is television. His argument is that fundamentally television introduced this, he would never use the word desensitization, so I'm going to avoid it. Because by talking about desensitizing, you automatically make the assumption that the people who are sharing these jokes are inherently, almost to the point of, if not immoral, then certainly amoral. And it ties around that issue about the morality of jokes. And that isn't his case. He said basically that these people can feel and do feel about this. The remorse and sorrow and loss in the wake of disaster. And that is a sentiment that is in equal proportions. And you see it on the internet, and you see it in day-to-day discourse as well. That when these things happen, there is a collective sense of tragedy. Simultaneously, there are these jokes. And his argument is basically that is the expectation of that this is how you ought to feel. That one of the things that television does is he talks about the emotional hegemony. That it is imposing this notion not simply that this is an opportunity to feel something, but that you must. I love the way that he contrasts it against political jokes in Eastern European socialist totalitarian states, in that there were jokes about politics that shouldn't have been made because there's a risk behavior. And the jokes that were told were often told by people who were nevertheless willing perpetuants, willing conformists to the state, in the same way that there was sort of not necessarily anti-Nazi, but anti-Hitler, or at least Hitler jokes during the years of his position. And it's not that there wasn't the possibility of it's not that these people weren't willing participants. It's that they were simultaneously, there was a bit of a pushback. Political jokes are sometimes not so much an index of political opposition as a way of playing with the forbidden, of taking time off from the official line. Individuals in authoritarian societies may well tell these jokes regardless of their political views, just as in democratic societies they may tell disaster jokes regardless of their emotional responses to disaster. Many true believers and true mourners may exclude themselves, but this leaves a wide spectrum of responders. There can be an evasion of and resistance to hegemony, even from those who do not seek to undermine or even challenge its legitimacy. It is unfortunately probable that most Germans and Austrians supported the Third Reich, even if they sought an escape through jokes from being perpetually told that they must. So it's the compulsory message that is one of the big impelling causes of jokes. It isn't desensitization to disaster. It isn't the fact that these people are unfeeling in some way. It's that they resent being told how to feel. And jokes are fundamentally pushing back at that. They are not making fun of the Challenger disaster. They are not making fun of the death of Diana. They are not making fun of the attacks against the World Trade Center. What they are doing is they are pushing back against the overwhelming rhetorical messages that particularly television is giving about how you, person at home, ought to be feeling. So it just makes it that much more pressing that is what is being resisted. It is not a repudiation of taste. It is not a repudiation of the value of the lives of the victims. It's a repudiation of the mandatory nature of the emotional manipulation. That, with television, is made that much more apparent because the message exists alongside the strange, anachronistic isn't the right word, but anomalous pairings of happy-go-lucky commercials, of the sentiment of the commercial establishment in buying products and so on. So you have the somber music of mourning that takes place in sort of the 24-hour news cycle. I know now he was writing well in the age of cable news, but he is referring many of these examples predate it. I guess the Challenger was the age of CNN, but certainly not the Kennedy assassination or Robert Kennedy's assassination. Nevertheless, they are present. And he talks about the incongruity of television as a medium in and of itself. And this is where his editorializing is lovely, and I recommend you peruse it. Where he talks about the first incongruity is that television is a rubbish sandwich. The announcement of sad and shocking disasters alternates not merely with advertisements, but with programs that are by any standard banal and trivial, such as low IQ quiz shows, costume dramas from England, which are far more costume than drama, American sanitized thuggery for cheap excitement, and saponaceous operas. Television is a world of free circuses and advertisements for white sliced cardboard bread in which trivia are used to sell trivia and appearance takes precedence over analysis. Just to go on, it is as if an official letter telling a family that one of their members in the armed forces had been killed in action were to arrive in a glitzy envelope with smiley face stickers accompanied by advertisements for soap powder and chocolate bars. Other forms of mass media that predate it, like the newspaper, newspapers have both shocking news and ads and comics. But for one thing, you have control over over how to read, and they are distinguished from each other. The comics are back on the comics page, so it's not that they remove them, it's just that they are always in their appropriate place. Television doesn't have that same level of distance. The second is the television has always, as a medium, has often played with the blurring the line between fact and fiction to begin with, through mockumentaries, through reproductions or reenactments of things. And so our very idea of what constitutes true and what constitutes false is already a little bit jarring, so that when something that is of the ultimate truth hits us, we don't necessarily know how to react. There's an interesting analog in The Onion, the satirical newspaper, where on their first issue after the events of September 11th, where they sort of talked about, and they were nominated for a Pulitzer for how they were able to be a humor publication in that vacuum of solemnity that occurred after 9/11. And one of their stories was about how a real life Jerry Bruckheimer movie had hit, and the way that all of a sudden, the fantastic entertainment of disaster that we had seen through things like Independence Day or any number of films was visible, and people running through the streets not as hired extras but as terrified citizens. And again, when seeing those images on the same television that one sees the images of entertainment disaster, it is disquieting and uncertain, let alone when we start talking about blending fact and fiction and historical reenactments. A third incongruity comes when there's just this literal distance in that you are being told of the unspeakable suffering of people dying in famine, of the people in the on the Challenger, of whatever disaster one wishes to contemplate. It's being told of this within the comfort of one's living room, surrounded by the same trappings that one experiences all life. So there's just this remarkable distancing mechanism, which again, you could make an argument was present in the newspaper, but it's through words as opposed through the glitzier issues of image. And at the very least, as you had sort of earlier forms of visual news, like the newsreels in theaters, it was a collective experience, and it was something different from the everyday. It wasn't on the same screens, again, that like washing powder was being sold on. He also raises the question that he doesn't dwell on too much, but it's a good thing to think about, is because it has to do with that sort of emotional hegemony. And it's like, well, why should we feel bad? And beyond the general feeling compassion for one's fellow human being, which is not something that he disagrees with, it is again that emotional manipulation. It's like, don't know these people. They are not of my immediate network. And so while I can feel genuine empathy, I don't know if I need to feel grief in the same way that I am being encouraged to feel grief. I don't know if I need to feel loss in the same way that you seem to want me to be experiencing loss. And that is sort of one of the overwhelming issues. So it is this sort of remarkable pushback that takes place. He makes that interesting argument about how it's only in reaction to compulsory feelings that these jokes emerge. And he has that very interesting insight that it was only after teaching the Holocaust became a mandatory part of the Israeli school system that there was pushback, that jokes about the Holocaust emerged, and in Israel. And so that seems to suggest, and his conclusion is that it was the being told how to feel, the emotional manipulation of the medium that argues for the jokes. And then he talks about the internet. And again, he's writing this was published in 2003, 2004. And I think he was writing it a lot earlier. For one thing, he was writing in 2004, and he doesn't talk about 9/11 jokes, which was one of the big issues of jokes following mass-mediated disaster. And in fact, in this very same collection, which is a book about humor and an anthology of writings about humor and death called Of Corpse, that Peter Narváez edited. The very next article in this or the very next chapter in this, is Bill Ellis's work on humor responses immediately after 9/11. So Davies this is probably an earlier piece, or at least predates the 9/11 attacks. But he talks about how the internet has changed because how internet has changed disaster jokes because, first of all, we're able to have repositories of them. And so rather than, email had allowed for a rapid spread of jokes, but then they just sort of exist on server pages and so on. There might have been news groups, but as much as we can talk about how news groups informed the early internet and developed a lot of its ethos, they were not as accessible as something. It wasn't really until the HTTP protocols really sort of caught on and browsing that we can start to sort of talk about the internet as a real influence and a real actor in folkloric communication. But that repositories were possible. You could go and people could start creating their vernacular archives of these jokes, requesting that people submit either jokes on a particular topic or just sick jokes in general. And therefore, these disasters that primarily, or again, he's using the word disaster in a sort of particular way, but tragic jokes that emerge after a tragic news event, they can become circulated around the world despite the fact that the event is very local and doesn't necessarily mean much to individuals, but they're available and they become sort of part of the larger discourse. I would be interested, and I need to sort of read some of his later works to see how his ideas about the internet would have changed, because he's still dealing with very early internet. I would probably say like a 1.0 aspect, where it's still, yes, it's easy to set up a web page. Yes, people can create these archives. Yes, people can submit, and yes, but he's still saying that television is the dominant medium, and that the jokes that exist on the internet are being still occasioned by the news that is coming through television, in part because the internet doesn't have the same sort of censorship protocols, and probably wasn't as big a source of news You weren't getting your news from the internet. You were still primarily getting it through the media. News infiltration hadn't happened in the same extent. I wonder what he would be thinking about jokes in terms of social media, because one of the things that happens when you have something like a Facebook feed is precisely that same level of incongruity, where you have, first of all, you have a different filtering mechanism, because as opposed to network programming, network advertising, network news, and sort of the patchwork and incongruity that has that, you have it's a slight curation that you are able to do, but your friends' information, your friends' news, the things that your friends share, so their choices of news. If you have selected, if you have subscribed to news sources, that what comes up, and advertising, and so you have the same rubbish sandwich. It's just different bread more than anything else. And so where stories can become deracinated, and again, if you are old enough to have Facebook, not that you guys, not that people watching this are necessarily too young, but maybe just like, yeah, that's an old person's medium. But Twitter is the same, and Instagram is the same. You sort of have this scroll, and depending on how well cultivated or how well curated your feed is, you will still come across this bizarre juxtaposition of the sincere and the jokey. And so whenever a news disaster happens, you will come across and people start going online and either sharing the story or sharing their, oh my God, I can't believe that this has happened. Flip, flip, flip. There's still going to be the person who hasn't heard, or your algorithm is like picking up this person's feed from 3 days ago. It's like, here's a Minions meme, and it's like, Ruth Bader Ginsburg has died. Oh, look, here's a joke about how you can never have too many books, and so on. So a different kind of juxtaposition is taking place, and further aspects in terms of the even less faith in, and now a larger, more vocal absence of faith in news stories, and absence of faith in the very idea of objective reporting or of facts. So how do jokes fit into that milieu? It's an interesting question. But at the very least, we can see that jokes are, and humor in general, and jokes in particularly, are a form that we have. We understand, even if we're not good joke tellers or good joke coiners, we understand the aesthetics. They are forms that we recognize. They're often formulaic. They're often intensely formulaic. What do you call? No one. I mean, there's two instances. What do you call is a legitimate question about vocabulary or the opening formula of a joke. Those are the only times you ever use those. So the what do you call, I'm immediately framing what's going to happen to this after as a joke and how I'm going to be interpreting it. They are received. There's an aesthetics. There's an aesthetics of taste. There's an aesthetics of form. And sometimes if the form is good, then the taste, I don't know about that, but that was a pretty darn good pun, I have to admit. It's intensely racist, but the wordplay, the license that joking allows, the temporary pushback against the strictures of decency. Doesn't because collections of jokes or the preponderance of jokes can perpetuate and reinforce and undergird and fundamentally allow for the ongoing stereotyping and othering. One doesn't want to merely dismiss jokes as play, but they fall in the sort of gray area between as an area of concern. At least they help us direct our attention towards what is being considered appropriate and inappropriate at any given time, and when is it inappropriate and when is it too inappropriate, and how we can sort of use these as barometers of taste. But they are expressive. They're communicative. They are interpersonal communications, even when they are repositories on the internet. They are fundamentally, at least the idea is that they are efforts at being these interpersonal communications. You, me, I am using a received form, and I'm expressing something that, and in terms of topicality, I'm expressing something that is immediate, that is perhaps surprising, that is it's relevant because you understand it, and there's also the status that's accorded to doing it, if not necessarily well, then maybe at least doing it first. So jokes are an area that it's a complicated topic to discuss, but it's a fun one. And it's fun even when the jokes are disquieting, even when we go, I don't like that. They are good opportunities to think about the aesthetics of language, to think about the creativity of interpersonal communication, and to think about how topicality comes to bear on us, and how one of the things that these jokes do is they are deliberately, intentionally tying us in to a larger and larger community through the act of fundamentally expressing an opinion. Jokes are okay. Jokes are good to study. And Christie Davies' work should be read. I would read it cautiously. It's always good. I think for the most part, he's always right. But he doesn't pull his punches. And we're used, as I said, to the politesse of writing. And maybe we shouldn't be. Anyway, my name is Ian. As I said, I bid you nothing but the best. We've been talking about Christie Davies' jokes that follow mass-mediated disasters in a global electronic age. Until the next time, my friends, I bid adieu.